Have you ever walked out of someone's home, and felt like your soul was heavier than when you entered, not because of the furniture, not because of the conversations, but because of something deeper, something invisible, yet unmistakably draining? After 65, you begin to notice the weight of energy. You start to feel which places nourish you, and which ones quietly destroy your peace. And the truth is, not every door you walk through deserves your presence, not every table deserves your stories, not every home deserves your time. This is the second half of life, and in this season, the autumn of your soul, your most sacred task is no longer to please others, but to protect the peace you've spent decades trying to find. Let me ask you this: what if the greatest danger to your emotional health isn't sickness or solitude, but the people you still choose to sit with, the ones whose homes you visit out of habit, guilt, or duty, when deep down, you know they leave you emptier than before? You see, the first half of life is about expansion, more friends, more experiences, more possessions. But the second half, it's about subtraction. About choosing less, but choosing it well, less noise, but deeper meaning, less people, but richer souls, less distraction, and more stillness, because after 65, you realize something. Silence is no longer awkward, it's healing. Solitude is no longer loneliness, it's clarity. And peace becomes more valuable than gold. In this video, we're going to explore something no one talks about in public, but that every wise elder has felt deep in their bones. There are some homes you should never walk into again, not because you're better than them, but because you've finally learned to love yourself enough to walk away. So lean in, and listen carefully. This isn't about judgment, this is about survival, of your spirit, your joy, and your final years on this earth. Let us begin. Have you ever visited someone's home, and after just an hour there, you felt like your heart had shrunk a little? You walked in smiling, but walked out sighing. Your body wasn't tired, but your soul was. Your energy felt robbed. Let me tell you a story you may find strangely familiar. Her name is Margaret. She's 72. Widowed, her days are simple: tea at dawn, gentle gardening, quiet afternoons with a good book. But every Thursday, she visits her cousin Irene. It starts innocently: "How are you?" But soon, the air thickens with complaints: "The government is useless. You know, my neighbor still hasn't trimmed that ugly tree. These new doctors, they don't know anything." And of course, kids today have no respect. The room becomes a graveyard of broken opinions, each one laid out like a funeral for hope. By the time Margaret leaves, her shoulders are heavier, her tea tastes bitter that night, sleep doesn't come easy, and the worst part, she doesn't even realize why: because complaints are invisible toxins. They don't raise your blood pressure immediately, they don't scream or bite, but they seep, they spread, they embed themselves in the fabric of your mind. Psychologists call this emotional contagion, the idea that we catch feelings the same way we catch colds. Spend enough time with someone who sees life through a fog of misery, and you'll begin to see the world the same way: gray, cloudy, unkind. Why is this so dangerous after 65? Because your emotional immune system is more sensitive than ever. You've lived through loss, change, and hard-earned growth. You've earned peace. But negativity is a thief. It doesn't just steal your joy, it steals your presence. It takes the fresh air from your lungs and replaces it with the stale breath of regret. And here's the heartbreaking truth: people who complain all the time aren't bad people. Often, they're in pain, often, they don't even know they're doing it. But pain that's unprocessed becomes poison. And when it's poured into every conversation, every interaction, you become the container. Let me repeat that: when you stay too long in the house of complaints, you become the container. You carry their bitterness home, you replay their pessimism in your thoughts, you begin to worry about things that don't even belong to you. So what do? You could argue, you could try to change them, but at this stage of life, is that really your mission? After 65, your job is no longer to rescue others from their misery. Your job is to protect your peace like a temple, to filter what enters your spirit, to keep your days as light and open as your lungs in the morning air. So here's the shift: when someone begins a conversation with, "You know what I can't stand?" You don't have to listen, when the room darkens with the weight of someone else's resentment. You don't have to stay, you're not being rude, you're being wise, you're honoring what you know to be true. That peace is fragile, that joy, after 65, is no longer optional. It's sacred. Margaret, in our story, realized this. One evening, while trimming her lavender bush, she whispered to herself, "I feel lighter on Wednesdays." She paused. Why? It hit her. Wednesdays were the days she stayed home, no visits, no cousin, no river of complaints, just the wind, her tea, the garden, and the silence. That night, she made a choice. She still loved Irene. But love doesn't mean proximity. Love doesn't mean exposure. Love sometimes means loving from a safe distance. She began writing her cousin letters instead, gentle, kind, encouraging ones. Irene didn't change much. But Margaret did. Her sleep returned. Her laughter softened. Her mind cleared. She didn't add anything new to her life. She just subtracted the unnecessary weight. Dear listener, here's what I want you to remember. Not every house deserves your footsteps. Not every voice deserves your ears. Not every story deserves your attention. If it doesn't bring you peace, if it doesn't uplift your spirit, if it drains your joy, you have permission, real, sacred permission, to leave, to say, "My spirit matters more than your monologue. My peace matters more than politeness. My joy is not your dumpster." Let the house of complaints be someone else's address. You don't have to live there, not even for an hour. After all, this season of your life should sound like birdsong, not like endless sirens. It should feel like sunlight, not like smog. You've earned this, now protect it. And that brings us to the next type of home, one that's not filled with noise, but with manipulation, where guilt becomes a currency, where love is used as leverage. Let us enter the manipulator's home, but only as observers, so that we may never live there again. Stay with me, let's keep going. Let me ask you something. Have you ever left someone's home with a smile on your face, yet a knot in your stomach? They didn't shout, they didn't insult you. In fact, they might have even called you dear. They offered tea, asked about your health, but somehow, you walked away feeling smaller, guiltier, like you just committed a sin by standing up for yourself. Welcome to the manipulator's home, where guilt is not just a feeling, it's a currency, a weapon, a way to control. You see, some people don't need to raise their voice to drain you. They don't need to insult you to control you. They just know how to twist your kindness into obligation. They say things like, "Oh, you're too busy to visit your poor old aunt now. I guess your new friends are more important than family. Must be nice to live your life, while I sit here alone." And the worst part, they say it with a smile, as if they're joking, as if they're just being honest. But behind every word, is a hook designed to reel you in, to make you feel like a bad daughter, a selfish friend, an ungrateful soul. This is the home where love comes with invisible strings, where every favor comes with a silent invoice, where they don't ask, they expect. Let me tell you a story. His name is Daniel. He's 68, divorced. Retired teacher, loves classical music and long walks in the park. He has a sister, Clara. Every time he visits Clara, she makes it sound like a reunion. She hugs him, smiles, pours coffee, and then slowly, the conversation shifts. "If only I had a son like you. If you really cared, you'd help me pay off this bill. You know, Mom would have wanted you to help me more." At first, Daniel thought she was just emotional, but after every visit, he noticed a pattern. He would leave feeling guilty, that even though he had done nothing wrong, and the guilt made him return, and return, and return again, not out of love, but out of fear of being seen as the bad one. That's the genius of emotional manipulation. It disguises control as care, it uses your kindness as a leash. And it is deadly, not to your body, but to your spirit, because when you're constantly trying to prove that you're good enough, you lose the joy of simply being. You become a servant to expectations, a hostage to obligation, a guest in someone else's script, a script you never agreed to act in. Why is this especially dangerous after 65? Because guilt becomes heavier with age. because time becomes more precious. Because your ability to set boundaries becomes more urgent, and more difficult. You think, I don't want to die with regrets. So you say yes. Again, you think, what if they're truly alone? So you bend. Again, you think, maybe I am being selfish. And so you give. Again, but here's the truth no one tells you: you are not selfish for protecting your peace, you are not heartless for setting boundaries, you are not cruel for saying no to emotional blackmail, you are finally wise, because love, true love, does not require self-abandonment. Love does not manipulate, love does not guilt-trip, love does not say, if you loved me, you would. It says, even if you can't, I still love you. Let me return to Daniel's story. One day, after another visit laced with guilt, he sat in the park. He noticed how quiet the world was when no one was demanding anything from him. He realized, this peace is the life I've earned. Why am I trading it for someone else's approval? So he did something he had never done before. He wrote his sister a letter, a kind one, but firm. He wrote, Dear Clara, I love you. But I can no longer be the emotional ATM you withdraw guilt from. I will always care for you, but I will no longer visit out of fear. If we're to have a relationship, it must be mutual, joyful, and free. Otherwise, I'll love you from afar. She was angry. Of course, manipulators hate when their tools stop working, but over time, something changed. She didn't stop being herself, but Daniel did. He stopped apologizing for living his life. He stopped shrinking to fit into someone else's idea of good. And in doing so, he expanded, his lungs breathed deeper, his heart felt lighter, his days felt his own. Dear listener, after 65, your greatest wealth is not money, it's time, it's energy, it's freedom from guilt that was never yours to carry. So I ask you this: who are you still visiting out of guilt, whose love feels like a trap, whose smile makes you question yourself, and more importantly, what would your days feel like if you stopped? Because you have that power. You can walk away, you can love and leave, you can forgive and protect, you can care. Without being controlled, your peace is no longer up for negotiation, not at this age, not in this chapter, not when your soul has waited decades for freedom. So let the manipulator keep their home, let them play their games. You have gardens to walk through, skies to stare at, and sunsets to breathe in. You have a life to live, not a guilt trip to endure. And that brings us to the next house, the house of chaos, the place where drama is served with every meal, where calm is a stranger, and your nervous system is constantly under siege. Let me ask you something: have you ever stepped into someone's home and suddenly felt like you didn't belong, as if every inch of the room whispered, you're not enough? The marble floors, the grand chandelier, the imported tea set from Europe, and of course, the owner, polished, poised, and subtly smirking, as they list their latest cruise, their daughter's third degree, their son's mansion in New York. You smile, you nod, you sip politely. But inside, you start shrinking. You question the life you've built. You look at your shoes, your old watch, your quiet stories, and for a brief moment, you feel poor, not in money, but in worth. Welcome to the show-off's mansion. A place that looks like a palace, but quietly robs you of your peace. This is not about wealth. Wealth, in itself, is not the enemy. It's about comparison. It's about the performance. In these homes, you're not a guest, you're an audience, expected to clap, to marvel, to feel less, so they can feel more. Let me tell you a story. Her name is Mrs. Lon, 72, a retired midwife. She helped deliver over 2,000 babies in her life. Never rich, but always kind. Always respected. One day, she visited her old schoolmate, Trin. They hadn't seen each other in 30 years. Trin welcomed her with open arms, into a house filled with glass, gold, and grandiosity. As they drank tea, Trin showed her photos: my son's villa in Singapore, my daughter's medical conference in Sweden, my grandchildren's international piano competitions. Mrs. Lon smiled, politely, softly. When Trin finally asked, "And what about your children?" Lon paused, and said quietly, "They're doing well. Simple lives. But they're kind." There was silence, a smile that barely hid pity, then another round of, "You should see our new rooftop pool." Mrs. Lon returned home, her small kitchen, her old wooden chairs, the photos on her wall, none of them staged for show, and for a brief moment, she felt small, even after all she'd done, all the babies she'd welcomed into the world, all the nights she'd worked under flickering hospital lights. She doubted herself. Why? Because comparison is a thief, not just of joy, but of identity. You see, the danger of the show-off's mansion is not in the furniture. It's in the atmosphere, the quiet message that success is loud, value is visible, status is everything, and if your life isn't shiny, it must be dull. But here's the truth that no one in those marble halls will tell you: what makes a life meaningful cannot be measured in square footage, or cars, or bank accounts, or Instagram-worthy vacations. It's in the hands you held, the people you comforted, the wisdom you passed down. The stories you carry, even the quiet ones. Especially the quiet ones. You don't need a rooftop pool to be rich in spirit. You don't need a degree from Paris to be wise. You don't need to dazzle, to matter. Let me return to Mrs. Lon. That night, she sat on her porch, the stars overhead, the soft breeze brushing past her faded curtains, and a thought arrived, gentle, but strong: I may not own much, but I've left pieces of myself in thousands of hearts. What could be more grand than that? She smiled, and something in her heart stood tall again. Dear listener, after 65, you do not need to prove anything to anyone, ever again. You've survived wars, outside and inside. You've buried dreams and planted new ones. You've known loss, and still, you've loved. That's your wealth. So when you visit the show-off's mansion, notice the sparkle, appreciate the view, but do not measure yourself against it. You are not a price tag. You are not a bank statement. You are not behind. You are simply you. And if being in that space makes you feel like less, you don't need to stay, because peace is found in places where you are seen, not compared, where your stories are heard, not outshined, where your presence is enough, not turned into a mirror for someone else's pride. So choose your company wisely. Visit the homes where your laugh feels welcome, where your silence isn't awkward, where your ordinary life is met with awe, not analysis. Because in the end, it's not about who had the bigger house, but who made others feel at home. And that brings us to the next chapter, a home more dangerous than any mansion. One that isn't built of bricks, but of chaos. Let me begin with a truth you've likely learned by now: not all noise comes from mouths, and not all silence is peaceful. Some homes, though filled with voices, movement, food, laughter, leave you emptier than when you arrived. You don't know why, but when you leave, you feel like you've lost something. Not your wallet, not your keys, your center. That's the kind of house we're visiting today, not made of stone, but made of spiraling energy, of shouting, gossip, tension, of spiritual emptiness masked by material fullness. Let me tell you the story of Uncle Min. He was 78 when he moved in with his nephew's family after his wife passed away. I'll be surrounded by people again, he thought. It'll be good. But the first morning told a different story. The TV was blaring by 6 a.m., phones buzzed constantly. His nephew and wife argued about bills, then about the kids, then about each other's tone. No one made eye contact. No one asked how he slept. The children ran, yelled, crashed through the house, while the parents stared at screens, scrolling. At dinner, everyone ate quickly, barely speaking, then disappeared into separate rooms, each carrying their own storm. Uncle Min sat in the living room, silent, invisible, present, but not really there. That night, he told himself, it's just the first day. But weeks passed. And every day was the same, noisy, yet devoid of warmth, crowded, but spiritually cold, busy, but directionless. And over time, Uncle Min, once a lively man who told stories, played the flute, watered his plants, stopped doing all those things. he couldn't concentrate, he forgot to eat, he lost weight, he lost laughter, he lost himself. What happened? He entered a home that was physically full, but spiritually bankrupt. That kind of environment is more dangerous than loneliness, because it doesn't just isolate your body, it isolates your soul. You see, the chaotic spiritually empty home is not just loud in sound, it's loud in vibration. It vibrates with unresolved anger, with constant comparison, with suppressed disappointments, with people living without purpose. Filling the void with noise and objects, these homes have no rhythm, no stillness, no spiritual gravity, and for someone in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, who's searching for peace, reflection, and legacy, this chaos is like a spiritual poison. Let me explain it another way. Imagine your soul as a lake, still, clear, reflective. Now imagine dropping a stone of noise, then another of anxiety, then one of resentment, then another of rushed energy. Before long, the lake is not reflective. It's turbulent, cloudy, polluted, and what happens to polluted water? It can no longer support life. In the same way, when we spend too much time in chaotic, spiritually empty homes, our inner peace, our sacred lake, can no longer support clear thought, joy, or even prayer. You may begin to notice, you forget your own rituals, you stop praying, you delay meditation, you start skipping your morning walk, you avoid silence because the chaos has followed you inside. That's not just discomfort, that's spiritual erosion, and the hardest part, it sneaks in slowly. You don't realize your soul is shrinking, until you wake up one day, and feel like a guest in your own mind. Now, does that mean every busy household is toxic? No, some are full of love despite the mess, some are loud but full of music, shared meals, and warmth, but the homes we speak of now, are those that are loud but unloving, busy but soulless, materially rich but spiritually dead. So how do you recognize one? Here are the signs. No one listens to each other. Conversations are mostly complaints, criticisms, or comparisons. No spiritual practices are honored. No space for reflection, gratitude, prayer. The television never turns off. Devices are always in people's hands. But no one is truly present. You feel tired after every visit, emotionally, not physically. You begin doubting your value because no one truly sees you. These are the homes where you don't just lose time, you lose pieces of your soul. And here is the hardest truth. Sometimes these homes belong to family, children, siblings, old friends, but your soul doesn't understand blood, it only understands vibration. So even if the house belongs to your son, if every visit leaves you emotionally drained, spiritually confused, and mentally clouded, you have a right to leave, or not go at all. You are not a prisoner to family ties, you are a guardian of your inner peace. And after 65, peace is no longer a luxury, it is your birthright. Let me return to Uncle Min. One afternoon, he left the house for a short walk. He sat on a bench under a tree and met another elderly man, Mr. Tuan, who sat quietly, reading. They exchanged smiles, then stories. Soon, Uncle Min began visiting Mr. Tuan's home. No television, no shouting, just a pot of tea, some quiet music, books, prayer beads, laughter that came not from jokes, but from calm. Uncle Min began to return to himself. He took up his flute again, he started sleeping well, he began humming, he smiled more. He still visited his nephew's house, but less often, and only when he had the energy, because he realized something profound. Your soul has a home too, and not every house you visit deserves to be its guest room. So, dear listener, after 65, let your compass change. Don't just ask, who's inviting me? Ask, what do I feel when I'm there? If you leave feeling lighter, go again. If you leave feeling heavier, go less. And if you leave feeling like you've lost your center, don't return. Your time is sacred now, not because it's short, but because it's wise. Every moment you protect your peace, you reclaim your power. So seek out homes that breathe gently, that honor stillness, that remember to bless the food, that allows silence without awkwardness, that lift your soul, instead of draining it, because in the final chapters of life, it's not the loudest homes that matter, but the ones where your soul finally exhales, and says, "I am home." The journey we've taken thus far has illuminated the houses and environments you must avoid after 65, the homes that drain your energy, confuse your purpose, and steal your peace. But let's not stop at just avoidance. What about the homes you should build? After all, avoiding the wrong environments is only part of the equation. The real work begins when you consciously choose the spaces, both external and internal, that allow your energy to flourish. And let me be clear, this doesn't mean building a mansion or filling your home with luxury. No, what I'm talking about is creating an inner and outer sanctuary that nourishes you, shields you from negativity, and empowers your soul to bloom in your later years. Let me introduce the 4 homes you must build after 65, if you wish to protect your energy, regain your strength, and create an environment where your spirit can truly thrive. 1. The home of self-compassion, a sanctuary of love and understanding. The first house you need to build isn't a place at all, it's the most important home of all, your own heart. After decades of giving, nurturing, and caring for others, you've probably forgotten how to care for you. It's easy to lose sight of yourself when you've spent so many years focusing on others. But now, at this stage of life, you must turn that focus back inward. Self-compassion is the foundation of all true energy protection. If your heart isn't safe, if you haven't given yourself the grace to rest, to heal, to feel understood, then all other homes will feel hollow. Think of self-compassion as a daily practice, a practice of speaking gently to yourself. In your 60s and beyond, the world can often be a demanding place, but you've earned the right to be gentle with yourself. To forgive yourself. To allow yourself time to breathe without guilt. Start small. Spend 5 minutes a day in silence, just being with yourself. When negative thoughts arise, gently replace them with affirmations of love and strength. Acknowledge your feelings without judgment. As you build this inner sanctuary, you'll notice that the world around you changes. Instead of seeking validation from external sources, you will become the center of your own strength. Your energy will be safeguarded by the love you give yourself. This sanctuary of self-love becomes a radiant light, and from that light, everything else will grow. 2. The home of healthy boundaries, protecting your peace, protecting your life. The second essential home is the home of boundaries, a sacred space where you defend your energy by knowing when to say no. After 65, your time and energy become even more precious. You've accumulated wisdom over a lifetime, and now, more than ever, it's vital that you protect your energy from the emotional toll of toxic relationships, unnecessary commitments, and draining environments. Setting boundaries isn't just about saying no to others, it's about saying yes to yourself. To your well-being, to your time, to your health. When you're younger, you may have said yes to everything because you didn't want to disappoint, or because you felt like you had to earn love and respect. But now, you must protect your energy, and that means setting boundaries that prioritize your own needs and desires. So how do you build this home of healthy boundaries? Recognize your limits. Know when you're stretched too thin and take a step back. Don't feel guilty for declining invitations, even if they come from family or longtime friends. Respect your own space, physical and emotional, and let others know where your limits are. Learn to let go of people who don't honor your boundaries. Not all relationships are meant to continue, and that's okay. Remember, boundaries aren't walls, they're simply the lines you draw to protect your peace. A healthy boundary creates the space for you to live authentically, to focus on what truly matters, and to conserve your energy for what's most important to you. 3. The home of quiet reflection, cultivating inner stillness and clarity. The third home you must build is the home of quiet reflection. When you live in a world that constantly bombards you with information, demands, and noise, it becomes increasingly important to find time to pause. To simply be. To listen not to others, but to your own soul. Reflection isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. It's where your clarity grows, where your decisions are born, and where your spirit finds peace. You must carve out moments of stillness in your daily life, spaces where you step away from the chaos, from external expectations, and reconnect with your inner voice. Here are some ways to build your reflective space. Set aside time each day, preferably in the morning or evening, to be alone with your thoughts. This could be through meditation. Journaling, or simply sitting in silence, disconnect from technology for a set time each day. No phones, no computers, no distractions. Just pure silence, spend time in nature, if possible. Let the stillness of the natural world remind you of the calm within yourself. Take moments to reflect on your journey, what you've learned, what you're grateful for, and where you want to go from here. By creating a home of reflection, you invite the clarity that will guide you in making decisions, avoiding emotional chaos, and protecting your energy from external pressures. 4. The home of meaningful connections, the power of nurturing true relationships. The fourth and final home you must build is the home of meaningful connections. Throughout your life, you've likely encountered many people, some of whom may have brought joy and others who have left you drained. But as you age, the nature of your relationships becomes more intentional. It's no longer about quantity, it's about quality. The people you allow into your life now must bring you peace, uplift you, and encourage your growth. Nurture relationships that honor you, respect your boundaries, and value your presence. These are the relationships that will fill you with energy rather than deplete you. How do you build this home of meaningful connections? Seek out relationships that nurture you, not ones that require emotional labor or constant effort. Let go of relationships that drain you, whether they're based on toxicity, manipulation, or indifference. Spend time with those who share your values, who understand your struggles, and who lift you up. Invest in new friendships that inspire you to grow and challenge you to be the best version of yourself. By surrounding yourself with people who understand you, respect your energy, and care for your well-being, you're creating a space where love, joy, and connection can truly thrive. As we approach the final chapter of this journey, I invite you to pause for a moment and reflect. We've talked about the homes you must avoid, the spaces that deplete your energy and rob you of your peace. We've also discussed the 4 homes you must build, the sanctuaries that protect your spirit and allow you to live with purpose and joy after 65. But now, in this final season of your life, there is one more piece of wisdom I must share. Your silence is golden. The noise of the world can be deafening, especially as we age. The hustle, the constant demands, the expectations, these things can feel even more overwhelming when your energy is limited. Yet, as you grow older, you will realize that silence is not just a retreat from the noise, it is a sacred space where your true self can finally emerge. The years you've spent striving, building, and perhaps even worrying, have culminated in this precious moment of quiet. Now, you are invited to enter a season where silence becomes a gift, a time to reconnect with the deep wisdom within you. The final season of your life is not a time for busyness or unnecessary distractions. It is a time for reflection, for gratitude, and for knowing that your presence alone is enough. In this sacred space, you have the privilege of choosing your energy, deciding where it flows and where it does not. You don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need to keep up with the pace of the world or adhere to its standards. In fact, you may find that as you grow older, you are less interested in external approval, and more focused on inner peace. The more you protect your energy and embrace the quiet, the more you realize that silence has its own power. Your final season is about honoring your story and allowing yourself to simply be. In this time, you will experience freedom, the freedom to spend your days however you choose, the freedom to walk away from relationships that no longer serve you, and the freedom to say no to anything that doesn't align with your soul's purpose. You've built your sanctuary of peace. You've established your boundaries. You've created connections that nourish you, and you've protected your energy from the chaos of the world. Now, the most important thing you can do is to preserve that sacred silence. This is where wisdom flourishes. In silence, your soul speaks. In silence, you find clarity. In silence, you remember who you truly are. As you move forward into this final chapter, let your silence be your guide. Let it become your greatest ally as you navigate the days ahead. Remember this, the world may try to fill your days with noise, but it is in the stillness of your heart that you find the richest treasures. In your silence, you are free. In your silence, you are golden.